In a move that has sparked both controversy and debate, the United States recently deported over 250 individuals alleged to be gang members to El Salvador. The deportees, shackled and under heavy guard, arrived on a flight chartered by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. They were met by Salvadoran authorities and immediately transported to the infamous CICOT mega prison. The majority of the deportees were identified as members of the notorious MS-13, a gang with roots in El Salvador and a long history of violence in both countries. Also included were members of Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang rapidly expanding its reach and brutality. This large-scale deportation is the result of a $6 million agreement between the United States and El Salvador. The agreement, shrouded in a level of secrecy, aims to stem the flow of gang violence and drug trafficking from Central America to the United States. However, the agreement has drawn criticism from human rights groups who argue that it violates the rights of those being deported, many of whom may face persecution or even death in their home country. Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele, known for his iron-fisted approach to crime, has defended the agreement and the construction of the CICOT prison. Bukele, in a thinly veiled jab at the United States, remarked that while the U.S. pays a very low fee to deport these individuals, El Salvador shoulders the high one of imprisoning and rehabilitating them. Upon arrival at CICOT, the deportees were processed under a strict protocol. Their heads were shaved, they were stripped of their clothing and issued prison uniforms, and their belongings were confiscated. They were then ushered into holding cells, bare concrete boxes with little more than a hole in the ground for sanitation. This harsh treatment, while shocking to some, is consistent with President Bukele's no-tolerance policy towards gang activity, a policy that has garnered him both praise and condemnation. The CICOT megaprison, located in a remote region of El Salvador, has become a potent symbol of President Bukele's war on gangs. Built to house tens of thousands of inmates, CICOT is a sprawling complex of concrete walls, watchtowers, and razor wire. Conditions inside the prison are notoriously harsh, with reports of overcrowding, inadequate food and water, and rampant violence. Human rights organizations have documented numerous cases of abuse and neglect within the prison walls. The prison, designed to isolate and incapacitate gang members, operates under a strict regime of control. Inmates are allowed minimal contact with the outside world, and their movements are heavily restricted. Educational and rehabilitation programs, considered crucial for reintegration into society, are scarce. Critics argue that such conditions, rather than reforming criminals, are more likely to harden them and fuel further violence. The decision to house the deported gang members in CICOT raises concerns about their safety and well-being. Many of these individuals have families and roots in the United States, and their sudden uprooting and detention in a foreign prison system have left them feeling isolated and afraid. The lack of transparency surrounding the agreement between the United States and El Salvador has fueled anxieties, with many fearing for their lives and the lives of their loved ones back home. The deportation of these individuals and their subsequent imprisonment in CICOT represent a significant escalation in the fight against transnational gangs. While the United States sees this as a necessary step to protect its citizens, critics argue that it is a short-sighted solution that fails to address the root causes of gang violence. They argue that a more comprehensive approach, one that tackles poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity, is essential to breaking the cycle of violence. The recent deportation of alleged gang members to El Salvador is not without its legal complexities. During the Trump administration, a controversial strategy emerged involving the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. This rarely used act, originally intended for wartime, grants the executive branch broad powers to detain and deport non-citizens considered enemy combatants. The Trump administration sought to apply this act to members of Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang that the State Department had designated as a terrorist organization. This move, unprecedented in its scope, faced immediate legal challenges. Human rights groups argued that the act was being misused to target individuals based on their alleged gang affiliation rather than concrete evidence of terrorism. The legal battle culminated in a federal judge ordering the Trump administration to halt the deportation of several Tren de Aragua members. The judge ruled that the government had failed to provide sufficient evidence to justify the use of the Alien Enemies Act, and that the deportations would likely result in irreparable harm to the individuals involved. The White House, however, maintained that the planes carrying the deportees were already in international airspace and could not be turned around. This incident, widely reported in the media, sparked a war of words between then-President Trump and President Buckel. In a now infamous tweet, Buckel responded to the judge's order with a taunt. "Oopsie, too late." This exchange highlighted the deep divisions and tensions surrounding the issue of gang violence and immigration between the United States and El Salvador. The recent deportation of alleged gang members to El Salvador exposes the complexities of the relationship between the United States and Central America. The United States, grappling with its own gang violence problem, often views deportation as a quick solution to a complex issue. However, this approach fails to acknowledge the role that U.S. foreign policy and economic policies have played in creating the conditions that lead to gang violence in the first place. The legacy of U.S. intervention in Central America, particularly during the Cold War, continues to cast a long shadow over the region. The support of authoritarian regimes, the funding of death squads, and the displacement of millions of people have all contributed to the instability and violence that plague the region today. Furthermore, U.S. economic policies such as free trade agreements that have benefited large corporations at the expense of small farmers and workers have exacerbated poverty and inequality in Central America. This, in turn, has created a fertile ground for gangs to recruit and thrive. Young people faced with limited opportunities and a lack of hope are easily lured into the false promises of power and belonging offered by gangs. The deportation of alleged gang members to El Salvador is not simply a matter of sending criminals back to their home country. It is a symptom of a much deeper and more complex problem, one rooted in a history of intervention, exploitation, and neglect. Addressing this problem requires a fundamental shift in U.S. policy towards Central America, one that prioritizes human rights, economic justice, and the creation of a more equitable and just society. Until then, the cycle of violence will likely continue, with devastating consequences for both regions.